Hamadan sits at an altitude that makes most Iranian cities feel low, nearly 1,800 meters above sea level, on the western edge of the Central Plateau, in the shadow of Mount Alvand, whose summit carries snow through half the year and whose lower slopes have been continuously inhabited since before recorded Persian history. It is a city of stone and cold winters and the specific kind of strategic depth that comes from being surrounded by terrain that armies have been learning to navigate for 3,000 years. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps did not choose the Hamadan region for historical resonance. They chose it because the mountain complex 12 kilometers southwest of the city offered a geological formation whose characteristics, granite core, overlying limestone cap, minimal seismic activity, stable water table, made it the most technically suitable location in the Western theater for the kind of installation that does not appear in any public document and whose function requires both physical protection and the communications infrastructure to reach, in real time, the proxy networks it supports across 4 countries. The facility was a coordination center, not a headquarters in the conventional military sense, not a place where generals reviewed maps and issued orders. It was the operational nerve center of the IRGC's external operations apparatus in the Western Theater, the facility where the financial transfer protocols for proxy militia units in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen were processed, where the encrypted communications architecture that linked IRGC case officers to their field networks was hosted, where the training curriculum for the specialized technical skills, drone assembly, improvised munitions construction, electronic attack techniques, was developed and transmitted to training sites distributed across the theater. It was, in the language of network analysis, the hub through which a significant fraction of the IRGC's non-state military power in the region flowed. Remove the hub and the networks continued to exist. They did not cease to function, but they functioned without the coordination, the resourcing, and the technical development pipeline that had been making them progressively more capable over the 6 years that the facility had been operational. 6 years of capability development delivered through a physical installation that had never been publicly acknowledged and whose destruction would degrade something that was harder to measure than a missile stockpile or an enrichment rate, but that the intelligence community's operational impact assessments had been measuring carefully. The rate at which Iranian-backed proxy forces were acquiring and deploying precision capabilities that had previously required state-level resources. The target folder had been assembled over 4 years from collection streams whose diversity reflected the facility's dual function. The physical collection was conventional: satellite imagery characterizing the surface infrastructure, geological survey data establishing the subsurface profile, signals intelligence mapping the facility's electromagnetic signature. The network collection was different in character. It traced financial and communications flows connecting the facility to its proxy networks, establishing its function through the patterns of activity that radiated from a specific Hamadan Highlands coordinate bearing the organizational signature of centralized direction rather than distributed autonomous operation. When the physical picture and the network picture overlaid onto the same coordinate, the folder was complete. The mission required consideration, not only of how to destroy the facility, but when, at what point in the operational cycle of the networks it supported, the destruction would produce maximum degradation. The timing analysis consumed 3 weeks. Its conclusion was a specific 72-hour window during which communications traffic volume and character indicated a coordination cycle peak. Multiple network elements simultaneously engaged in planning activity requiring central coordination. The window was 11 days away when the analysis completed. The mission had 10 days. The B-2 Spirit assigned to the mission lifted off at 10:33 p.m. from the forward operating location, carrying two GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators configured for the specific geological profile that the survey data had established. A granite core facility accessed through a limestone cap whose characteristics required a staged penetration, the first weapon opening a channel through the limestone cap and establishing the fracture geometry in the upper granite, and the second weapon following the channel into the granite at a depth that the facility's primary coordination and communications chambers occupied. The employment solution was sequential from a single aircraft, requiring two passes on parallel headings, separated by a lateral offset, computed to place the second weapon into the penetration channel of the first without the channel's geometry, deflecting the second weapon's terminal flight path. The lateral offset was 11 meters. The planning cell had computed it to within 3 meters of precision. The targeting system's GPS solution would deliver the rest. The pilot had been briefed on the timing analysis, not the operational detail of the proxy network planning cycles, which was not information a strike aircrew needed to execute their mission, but the operational significance of the 72-hour window and the fact that executing inside it was a mission requirement, not a planning preference. He understood what that meant. The window did not move for weather, for maintenance, or for the kind of accumulated small deviations that long-duration missions generate. It moved only if the threat environment made execution impossible. He had been asked in the briefing to assess the threshold at which the threat environment would constitute that condition. He gave the assessment that 19 years of flying this aircraft had given him the authority to give. The threshold was higher than anything in the pre-mission intelligence suggested he would encounter. He was satisfied with the mission. He taxied to the runway. The routing to the target required 13 hours and 22 minutes. The approach corridor exploited the Hamadan air defense sector's thinnest coverage geometry, the southern and southeastern approaches whose coverage the mission routing was designed to use. The southern approach added 31 minutes to the total flight time. At the 11-hour mark, when the fatigue that 13-hour sorties always produce had reached the phase where the body begins quietly renegotiating its commitments, those 31 minutes were a margin he used the way he used every resource, completely and without waste. The tanker contact at 2:17 a.m. completed in 15 minutes over the northern Arabian Sea. The boom operator made the connection on the second attempt. The first had been a geometry issue caused by a slight altitude deviation that the pilot corrected before the operator finished his repositioning call. Clean contact. Clean transfer. The aircraft continued north and east. The EW package that supported the penetration had been assembled from assets across the Gulf region in a configuration that the mission planners had optimized against the specific frequency architecture of the Hamadan air defense sector. The sector's primary coverage came from a Bavar 373 battery positioned south of Hamadan on the approach axis that the mission was using. Positioned there, the intelligence assessed, specifically to cover the southern approach corridor, whose thinness the mission routing was exploiting. The Bavar 373 on the southern axis was not a gap in the coverage. It was the coverage for that axis, and it was the system whose suppression the entire EW architecture was organized around. The two EA-18G Growler flights from the carrier group in the Gulf of Oman had their primary suppression allocation dedicated to this single battery. Everything else, the medium-range acquisition radars, the Tor-M one-point defense systems in the inner ring, the early warning radars on the ridgelines north and west, was managed with secondary allocations sized against the baseline assessment of those systems' operational status. The baseline assessment of the Tor-M1 inner ring had been established from imagery and signals collection conducted over the preceding 8 weeks. It placed 3 Tor-M1 batteries at mapped positions covering the 3 approach vectors into the facility's ridgeline. At 8:44 a.m. local time, 41 minutes before the B-2 entered the inner ring's coverage, the signal's intelligence feed showed one of the 3 batteries go electromagnetically silent. Not jammed, silent. The battery had ceased emitting on all monitored frequencies, a condition consistent with a powered-down status rather than an emissions control protocol. The signal's intelligence platform characterized the silence as a maintenance event with moderate confidence. Moderate confidence meant it might be maintenance and it might be something else, and the something else that occupied the mission commander's attention for the 3 minutes he spent assessing the situation was the possibility that the battery had been repositioned, moved to a new location that the pre-mission imagery had not captured, and from which it would be operating without the Growler architecture having a suppression allocation targeting its new position. He reported the anomaly on the data link. The planning element that was monitoring the mission's execution reviewed the characterization and assessed it as consistent with a scheduled maintenance cycle that the signal's intelligence database had logged as probable for this battery based on its operational tempo over the preceding weeks. Probable. The mission commander noted the assessment and noted the confidence level behind it and continued. The battery that was silent remained silent for the duration of the penetration phase. When it reactivated 4 hours after the mission's weapons employment, it reactivated from its original mapped position. It had been in maintenance. The moderate confidence assessment had been correct. The assessment had been made correctly, and it had been correct, and those 2 things are not always the same thing, and the mission commander knew the difference. The Bavar 373 on the southern approach axis received its jamming suppression at 9:21 a.m., 4 minutes before the B-2 entered its coverage range. The suppression was clean. The Growler architecture had full power allocated to the primary battery, and the frequency management was executing against the pre-mission signals intelligence database with the accuracy that the database's quality warranted. The Bavar 373's acquisition picture degraded within 3 seconds of the first jamming pulse. Its operators began the frequency management response that their training prescribed: primary frequency shift, backup frequency shift, tertiary frequency option. The Growlers followed each shift within the response times the planning had modeled. On the tertiary frequency shift, the response time was 9 seconds rather than the modeled 6, a 3-second gap caused by a data link latency event on the signal's intelligence feed that delayed the frequency characterization, reaching the Growler EW officer by the margin that mattered. In those 9 seconds, the Bavar 373's tertiary frequency produced 3 acquisition sweeps on clear spectrum. The first 2 sweeps returned nothing above the noise floor. The third sweep returned a contact at 41% detection confidence, 41%. The battery's automated engagement system displayed the return to the engagement controller with a color coding that the system's interface used for below-threshold contacts: yellow, not red. Yellow required logging and monitoring. It did not authorize engagement. The engagement controller looked at the yellow return. He looked at the jamming environment his sector was experiencing across 3 frequency bands simultaneously. He looked at the time, 9:25 a.m., and the track projection the system generated from the single 41% return, which placed the contact's projected position, if the return was valid, on a bearing toward the Mount Alvand complex at an altitude and velocity consistent with a fast jet. A single 41% return in a jammed environment on a bearing toward a sensitive installation. He picked up the direct line to the sector alert controller and reported a possible contact, below threshold, confidence low, requesting sector awareness notification. The sector alert controller received the report and issued an awareness notification to the Hamadan sector, a step below an active alert designed to elevate the monitoring posture of the sector's systems without triggering the full engagement authority protocols that an active alert would produce. The awareness notification reached the Tor M1 battery on the eastern approach vector at 9:27 a.m. The battery elevated its scan rate. It did not activate fire control. Its acquisition radar was operating on a frequency that the Growler architecture had partial suppression coverage for. The secondary allocation that covered the inner ring systems was running at 73% effectiveness on this battery's frequency. 73% left 27% of the battery's acquisition capability functional. Over the elevated scan rate, that 27% produced 7 acquisition sweeps in the 90 seconds between the awareness notification and the B-2's passage through the battery's coverage envelope. All 7 sweeps produced returns below the detection threshold. The B-2's radar cross-section profile at the current geometry, altitude, aspect angle, range, fell inside the threshold band that the Tor M1 system classified as weather clutter under its standard detection algorithm. The algorithm had been calibrated for its design threat set. The B-2 was not in its design threat set. The 7 sweeps returned clutter. The aircraft passed through the coverage envelope. At 9:33 a.m., the B-2 reached the first initial point over the Hamadan highlands. The pre-release checks completed in the compressed sequence that the terminal phase required. Targeting system update, GPS solution confirmation, weapons management system, verification of the 11-meter lateral offset between the 2 release positions, all confirmed. The bay doors opened with the structural shudder that the pilot had felt hundreds of times, and that his body still registered as significant regardless of the repetition, because the body does not habituate to the sensation of 15 tons of precision weapon separating from the airframe the way it habituates to other repeated stimuli. The first GBU-57 released. The aircraft corrected and turned onto the heading for the lateral offset. The first weapon's penetration through the limestone cap above the facility proceeded at the rate the geological profile had predicted. The limestone was consistent with the survey data. No surprises in the deceleration profile, no unexpected density variations, no material transitions at anomalous depths. The weapon reached the granite at 38 meters. The granite's deceleration signature was sharper than the limestone had been, a material transition that the fusing algorithm registered and used to update its depth estimate. The weapon continued into the granite. The fuse threshold was met at 62 meters, inside the upper granite layer, at the depth the planning had designated as the aim point for the first weapon's detonation. The explosion did not reach the primary chambers, which sat deeper. It was not designed to. It was designed to open a fracture channel through the upper granite and establish the penetration geometry that the second weapon would follow to the depth the chambers occupied. The second initial point was 49 seconds after the first release. The lateral offset had been achieved within 4 meters of the computed requirement. The targeting system's GPS solution had performed at its specified accuracy against a subsurface reference point that existed only in the target folder. The second GBU-57 released. The bay doors closed before the aircraft had completed its turn onto the egress heading. The pilot was already managing the post-release configuration before the second weapon's release was confirmed on the store's management display. He confirmed it in his peripheral attention and continued the configuration. The aircraft accelerated onto the egress heading. The second weapon entered the fracture channel, created by the first, its terminal guidance computing continuous corrections from the GPS constellation to hold it within the channel geometry as it descended through the fractured granite. The channel walls guided the weapon deeper than its own kinetic energy alone could have achieved in undamaged rock. The fractured granite presented reduced resistance along the channel axis, and the weapon's remaining velocity was sufficient to carry it to the depth where the facility's primary coordination chambers sat. The fuse threshold was met at 91 meters. The detonation inside the primary chamber was not contained by the chamber's structural walls. The walls had been designed to resist overpressure arriving from above through intact rock. The detonation was inside the chamber. The overpressure had nowhere to go except into the chamber's contents. The primary coordination room, the space housing the communication servers, the encrypted routing equipment, the financial transfer processing systems, the training curriculum development workstations, experienced the detonation at a range that produced a pressure event. The structural specifications of the equipment had not been designed to survive. The equipment did not survive it. The communications architecture that had been routing encrypted traffic between the Hamadan facility and proxy network elements across 4 countries went dark at 9:34 a.m. and 22 seconds. Simultaneously, in the network collection record, the traffic patterns that had been characterizing the coordination cycle peak, the timing analysis had identified ceased. Not degraded, ceased. The hub was gone. The secondary detonation that the mission planners had not explicitly planned for, but had assessed as possible, occurred at 9:34 a.m. and 51 seconds, 29 seconds after the primary. A fuel storage section in the facility's emergency power infrastructure, pressurized by the primary detonation's overpressure wave reaching it through a connecting tunnel, ignited and produced a secondary explosive event that extended the structural damage into the facility's eastern wing. The communications relay section that connected the primary coordination room to the fiber optic transmission infrastructure leading to the surface antenna arrays. The relay section was eliminated. The antenna arrays on the surface, now connected to nothing that was processing anything to transmit, continued to stand on the ridgeline above the facility. They would stand there until someone with the knowledge of what had been beneath them decided what to do about infrastructure that looked like telecommunications equipment, and was now exactly that, equipment with no function behind it. At 9:35 a.m., the first proxy network element to register the loss was a communications node in eastern Syria whose encrypted uplink had been active during the coordination cycle peak. The uplink dropped. The operator attempted re-establishment through primary, backup, and emergency channels. All 3 returned silence. He escalated. The escalation produced contact attempts from multiple network elements across the theater, each confirming the same silence. Understanding came later in fragments, as the network processed the absence of the facility that had been organizing its activities for 6 years. The B-2 was 360 miles into its egress when the Syrian operator made his first escalation call. The pilot was running his post-strike systems check and calculating the fuel state against the next tanker rendezvous, which the planning had placed at a position that reflected the egress routing's optimization against the Iranian Air Defense Network's reconstitution timeline. The tanker was 2 hours and 17 minutes ahead. The fuel state was consistent with the plan. The systems check produced 2 notations, neither mission critical, both requiring maintenance attention on landing. He notated them and continued. The post-strike tanker contact at 12:09 p.m. completed in 14 minutes. The aircraft turned west. The data link confirmation code had been transmitted and received at 9:36 a.m. The planners who received it began cross-referencing the network collection data against the mission timeline. The traffic cessation at 9:34 a.m. corresponded to the weapons employment sequence within the margin of transmission propagation time. Both chambers confirmed. The coordination cycle peak that the timing analysis had identified was interrupted at the moment of maximum activity. The proxy network elements that had been engaged in active planning cycles through the facility's communications infrastructure were operating without central coordination for the first time in 6 years. They would develop workarounds. Networks do. The workarounds would take time. The time was the point. The numbers that closed the package: 13 hours and 22 minutes of flight time, 2 GBU-57. Massive ordnance penetrators employed in a 49-second interval on parallel headings with an 11-meter lateral offset. 1. Bavar 373 tertiary frequency shift that produced a 9-second Growler response gap and a 41% detection contact logged as yellow by an engagement controller whose protocol correctly held him from acting on it. 1 TOR-M, 1 battery with degraded suppression that ran 7 acquisition sweeps against a target whose radar cross-section fell below its detection threshold on every sweep. 1 silent TOR-M, 1 battery assessed at moderate confidence as maintenance. Assessment proved correct 4 hours later. 0 aircraft lost. Both chambers eliminated. The coordination hub for IRGC proxy operations across 4 countries went dark at 9:34 a.m. and 22 seconds during the peak of an active coordination cycle, interrupting planning activity across the network simultaneously. There is a form of military power that does not announce itself through launch signatures or detonation flashes. It operates through the relationships between people who share objectives, through the communication channels that sustain those relationships, and through the technical capabilities that those channels enable. An institution that coordinates those relationships is not visible as a target the way a missile battery is visible. It is visible as a pattern in the flow of communications, in the distribution of resources, in the accumulated signature of organized activity over time. The pattern had been visible to the collection architecture for 4 years. The architecture had been translating it into the language of targeting coordinates for 3. On a morning in the Hamadan highlands, the translation was used. The networks it served remain. They are quieter now and slower and less precise. What coordination requires a physical facility to provide cannot be fully replaced by the alternatives that networks fall back on when the facility is gone. The ridgeline above Hamadan is unchanged. What was beneath it is geological record.